The Dream and the Divide. Mr. William Harris stood at the large window of his second-floor office, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the idyllic neighborhood below. The well-manicured lawns, the perfectly painted houses, and the pristine, tree-lined streets filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction. The community had taken years to build, years of strategic investments, late nights, and strict standards to ensure that only the right kind of people would live in what he considered a reflection of his life's work. It wasn't just a neighborhood to him. It was his legacy, a symbol of everything he believed in. Harris was a man who prided himself on his achievements. He had come from nothing, clawing his way up from a modest upbringing. He had worked hard, saved every penny, and learned the real estate business from the ground up. His first property had been a rundown apartment building, but with grit and determination, he had turned it into a high-end rental property. And from there, his empire grew. Now, as he stood in his grand office overlooking this exclusive community, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This neighborhood, these homes, were a testament to his success and to the values he held dear. He turned away from the window, moving back to his desk. There, framed photographs of his various properties lined the shelves, a visual reminder of his accomplishments. He ran his fingers over the polished wood of his desk, remembering the day he had signed the papers for his first building. "I've come a long way," he muttered to himself, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He settled into his leather chair, letting the familiar creak of the material bring him back to the present. On the desk in front of him lay a stack of rental applications. His rental policies were strict, and he made no apologies for it. He wasn't about to let just anyone move into his properties. He believed that his success was built on maintaining high standards, standards that protected both the value of his properties and the quality of life for his tenants. As he flipped through the applications, his sharp eyes scrutinized every detail. Education, occupation, income, all had to meet his exacting requirements. But more than that, Harris believed in a certain type of tenant, one that he thought would maintain the atmosphere of the community he had created. "Can't let just anyone in," he said aloud, his voice firm. "Got to keep things exclusive." His hand paused as he picked up one particular application. His brow furrowed slightly as he read the name. Thompson. A twinge of unease rippled through him. His gaze scanned the rest of the application. Everything seemed in order. Robert Thompson had a stable job, working as an engineer at a local firm. His wife, Lisa, was a teacher. They had 4 children, all boys, ages ranging from 5 to 10. By all accounts, they seemed like a decent, hard-working family. But then there was the issue of race. Harris's mouth tightened into a thin line. He had never outright stated that he wouldn't rent to black families, but his actions often spoke louder than words. He justified it to himself by saying that it wasn't about race. It was about maintaining the neighborhood's character, about making sure his tenants felt comfortable. And he was certain his other tenants wouldn't want black neighbors. They wouldn't say it, of course, but he knew. He could feel it in the unspoken understanding that existed between him and his tenants. "No," he muttered, tossing the application into the rejection pile with a shake of his head. "Can't have any of them here." He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of his decision settle over him. A part of him felt guilty, but he quickly shoved the feeling aside. He was doing what was best for the community, wasn't he? He had worked too hard to let one decision undo everything he had built. His mind wandered back to the faces of the other families in the neighborhood. They wouldn't want the Thompsons living next door. He was sure of it. "It's my property, my rules," Harris said aloud, as if trying to convince an invisible audience. Meanwhile, in a modest house across town, Robert and Lisa Thompson sat at their kitchen table, the excitement in the air palpable. Their 4 boys, Ethan, Noah, Jacob, and Caleb, gathered around them, their faces full of anticipation. On the table lay the papers that could change their lives. The rental application for one of Mr. Harris' properties. It was in the kind of neighborhood they had always dreamed of, A safe, beautiful place where their boys could grow up surrounded by good schools and opportunities. This could be it, Robert said, his voice filled with hope. He reached over and squeezed Lisa's hand. This could be the home we've been praying for. Lisa smiled warmly, her heart swelling with the same hope. They had been searching for a place like this for months, a place where their family could put down roots and thrive. And now, after so much searching, it felt like they were finally on the brink of something great. "We've done everything we can," Lisa said, looking at the papers. "Our credit's good. We've got the income, and the boys are excited. I just hope." Robert nodded, understanding the unspoken fear in her voice. They had faced rejection before. Sometimes it was overt, but more often it was subtle. A cool look from a landlord, a polite excuse as to why the property was no longer available. But Robert had a good feeling about this place. This time would be different. It had to be. The boys, sensing the importance of the moment, were quieter than usual. Even Caleb, the youngest, sat still, his wide eyes watching his parents expectantly. "What do you think, Dad?" Ethan, the oldest, asked. At 10, he was already protective of his younger brothers, always looking out for them. Robert smiled at his son, tussling his hair. "I think we're going to be just fine, buddy. We've done our part. Now, we just wait and see." As the Thompsons sat around their kitchen table, filled with hope and anticipation, they had no idea that Mr. Harris had already made his decision. The rejection was on its way. Another door closed simply because of the color of their skin. But as fate would have it, this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. Because, unbeknownst to Mr. Harris, his carefully constructed world was about to be turned upside down. The truth, shocking, unexpected, and deeply personal, was waiting in the wings, ready to challenge everything he thought he knew about race, family, and the values he held so dear. And when the truth finally came to light, it would not only shake Mr. Harris to his core, but it would also force him to confront the very prejudices he had spent his entire life justifying. For now, though, the two families stood on opposite sides of a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. One filled with hope, the other with a false sense of superiority. But the winds of change were about to blow, and neither family would ever be the same again. The rejection and the unexpected connection. A week passed, and the Thompson family's anticipation had grown into cautious optimism. Every day, Robert and Lisa exchanged hopeful glances over the breakfast table, each secretly wondering when they'd hear back from Mr. Harris about the application. For their boys, the suspense was almost unbearable, especially for Ethan, who had already told his best friend about the possible move. He could picture it so clearly. A bigger backyard to play football, a friendly neighborhood with lots of kids, and, of course, a safer street for riding bikes. But the Thompson family's hope would soon meet with cold reality. It was a gray Wednesday afternoon when the rejection letter arrived. Lisa was the first to see it, noticing the return address as soon as she pulled it from the mailbox. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been expecting good news, a chance to celebrate. She wasn't prepared for this. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and read the first few lines. The words were formal, even polite, but the message was unmistakable. They had been rejected. No explanation, just a polite regret that Mr. Harris had decided to move forward with another applicant. Lisa felt her heart sink. She stood there, holding the letter, her eyes welling up with tears. She knew what this meant. It wasn't about their financial standing, their jobs, or their ability to pay the rent on time. It was about something far uglier, something that couldn't be fixed with a better resume or higher income. She walked back inside, letter in hand, and placed it on the kitchen table. Robert was still at work, and the boys were at school, so she was alone with her thoughts. She stared at the letter, feeling the mixture of sadness and anger rising inside her. How could someone make a decision like this without even knowing them? Without seeing how much they had to offer? By the time Robert came home, Lisa had composed herself. She didn't want to alarm him or the boys. Robert had worked hard to keep their spirits up through the house hunting process, and she didn't want to crush the fragile hope they had built. But Robert, perceptive as always, noticed the tension in her face as soon as he walked in. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting his briefcase down. Lisa gave him a small, tight-lipped smile. "We got a letter from Mr. Harris," she said quietly. Robert's face lit up for a brief moment before he saw the look in her eyes. His heart sank, but he forced himself to ask, "And?" Lisa handed him the letter without a word. Robert read it quickly, the official-sounding language hitting him harder with each word. He had expected this, but he had hoped, against all odds, that maybe, just maybe, they would be given a fair chance. He folded the letter and set it back on the table, taking a deep breath before turning to Lisa. "We'll find something else," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He placed a hand on her shoulder, but they both knew what this rejection meant. It wasn't just about this house. It was about a system that had been stacked against them for as long as they could remember. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Robert and Lisa sat together on the couch, processing the day. They had made a point not to tell the children about the rejection yet, wanting to protect them from the sting of disappointment for a little while longer. "They didn't even give us a reason," Lisa said softly, staring at the ceiling. "They just decided." Robert sighed, leaning his head back. "It's the same story, different day. I just don't understand how people can be like that." Lisa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've done everything right, worked so hard, and still." Robert's jaw clenched. "It's not about us. It's about them, people like Harris. They think they're protecting their little world, keeping it exclusive." Lisa shook her head. "It's just so frustrating." Robert nodded in agreement, his thoughts swirling. He knew they couldn't dwell on this forever, but it wasn't easy to let go. They'd been taught resilience from a young age, but there were moments when even the strongest of hearts faltered. Across town, Mr. Harris remained blissfully unaware of the emotional weight his rejection had caused. It was just another day at the office for him, moving through rental applications and paperwork with practiced efficiency. He had already moved on from the Thompsons file, relegating it to the denied pile with a dozen others. The decision hadn't weighed on him at all. To him, it was business as usual. But fate had other plans for Mr. Harris, and they began to unravel that very night. Later that evening, as Mr. Harris settled into his plush leather chair at home, his cell phone buzzed on the side table. He glanced at the screen and saw his son's name. Alex. A grin broke across his face. Alex was away at college, and they hadn't spoken in a few days. "Hey, son," Harris greeted warmly, putting his phone on speaker. "How's school going?" "Hey, Dad," came Alex's voice, cheerful but slightly hesitant. "It's going well, but there's something I need to talk to you about." Harris frowned, his paternal instincts tingling. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, it's not a big deal, but it's kind of important," Alex said. "I've met someone I think you should know about." Harris' frown deepened, but this time it was out of curiosity. Alex had always been private about his personal life, especially when it came to dating. "Oh, well, tell me about her." Alex chuckled nervously. "Her name is Jasmine. We've been seeing each other for a few months now, and, well, things are getting serious. I wanted to introduce her to you, maybe bring her home for the weekend." Harris relaxed a little. "That's great, son. I'd love to meet her. What does she do? Is she in one of your classes?" There was a brief pause before Alex answered, his voice a little quieter now. "She's actually an engineering major, just like me. Smart, driven, all that good stuff. But, there's something else you should know. Jasmine's family. They're black." Harris felt his body tense, his grip tightening on the arm of his chair. "Black," he repeated, his voice neutral, though his mind was already racing. It wasn't that he had never considered the possibility, but hearing it now, knowing his son was serious about a black woman, shook him more than he'd care to admit. "Yes," Alex confirmed, the hesitation clear in his voice. "I wanted to tell you because I know how you feel about certain things, and I didn't want this to come as a shock." Harris struggled to maintain his composure. "I appreciate you telling me, Alex. I really do. But you have to understand, things are complicated when it comes to relationships like this. Have you thought about how other people might react? What kind of challenges you'll face?" "Of course, I've thought about it, Dad," Alex said, his tone firm. "But I love her. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I want you to meet her before you jump to any conclusions." Harris leaned back in his chair, feeling a familiar conflict rising in his chest. He had built his life on certain principles that, until now, had never been seriously challenged. And yet, here was his son, asking him to reconsider everything. "I'll meet her," Harris finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll meet her." "Thanks, Dad," Alex said, sounding relieved. "That's all I ask. You'll see. She's incredible." After they hung up, Harris sat in silence for a long time. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: pride for his son, confusion about his own feelings, and a nagging sense of unease about what was to come. He had spent his entire life enforcing boundaries, maintaining control over who was allowed into his world. And now, the person challenging those boundaries wasn't an outsider. It was his own son. The irony didn't escape him, but it left him more unsettled than ever. Little did Mr. Harris know that Jasmine was more than just his son's girlfriend. She was part of the very family he had just rejected, a fact that, once revealed, would unravel everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and the values he had spent a lifetime defending. Confronting the past and facing the truth. Mr. Harris spent the next few days in a haze, replaying his conversation with Alex over and over in his mind. His son, his bright, ambitious, straight-laced son, was dating a black woman. It wasn't the relationship that unnerved Harris the most. It was what it represented. Everything he had built, everything he had enforced through his rigid beliefs and standards, suddenly felt like it was unraveling. His son's relationship was a direct challenge to those beliefs, and Harris wasn't sure how to reconcile it. His phone call with Alex had opened a floodgate of questions he didn't have answers to. What would people think? What would his tenants, his colleagues, even his own family say if they knew his son was dating a black woman? Harris had built his life on maintaining control over his properties, his community, his image, and now it felt like he was losing that control. He tried to focus on work, burying himself in his usual tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Alex. And then there was the girl, Jasmine. He had agreed to meet her, but he already felt a sense of dread creeping into his chest. It wasn't that he disliked her. He hadn't even met her yet. But he couldn't help the feeling of discomfort. This wasn't how he had pictured his son's future. The following weekend arrived faster than Harris had anticipated. Alex called to let him know they would be arriving on Saturday afternoon, and Harris spent most of the morning pacing his living room, trying to prepare himself. His wife, Evelyn, had noticed his strange behavior, but chose not to press him about it. She had learned long ago that when William Harris was in one of his brooding moods, it was best to let him come around on his own. By mid-afternoon, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tense silence in the house. Harris straightened his posture, taking a deep breath. This was it, his first introduction to Jasmine. He had no idea what to expect, but he had resolved to keep his composure for Alex's sake. Evelyn was the first to greet Alex and Jasmine at the door. She smiled warmly, welcoming her son with open arms before turning her attention to the young woman standing beside him. Jasmine was strikingly beautiful, with warm brown skin, intelligent eyes, and a smile that immediately filled the room with light. Evelyn, always the gracious hostess, embraced Jasmine without hesitation, her instincts for warmth and kindness taking over. "It's so wonderful to meet you, Jasmine," Evelyn said, her voice sincere. Alex has told us so much about you. Jasmine smiled, her nervousness apparent, but softened by Evelyn's welcome. Thank you, Mrs. Harris. It's great to finally meet you both. Harris, standing a few steps behind Evelyn, nodded stiffly. Welcome, Jasmine. Glad you could join us. His words were polite, but there was a noticeable edge to his voice that didn't go unnoticed by Alex. Alex shot his father a look, sensing the tension, but decided not to address it just yet. Thanks, Dad. We've been looking forward to this. As they all moved into the living room, the conversation started off with the usual pleasantries: school, work, future plans. Jasmine spoke about her studies in engineering with a quiet confidence that clearly impressed Evelyn. Even Harris couldn't deny that she was intelligent, ambitious, and well-spoken, the kind of person any parent would be proud to see their child with. But for Harris, there was still an invisible barrier, something he couldn't put into words, but that sat heavy in his chest, a discomfort that wouldn't go away. As the evening wore on, Harris found himself watching Jasmine closely, trying to reconcile her presence with his long-held beliefs. She didn't fit the stereotypes he had carried in his mind for so long. She was poised, articulate, and deeply respectful. In fact, in any other situation, he might have found her delightful. But his biases were too deeply ingrained for him to easily let go. After dinner, as Evelyn and Jasmine cleared the table and Alex helped in the kitchen, Harris stood by the fireplace, staring at the flickering flames. His thoughts raced, but nothing made sense. He wasn't sure how to voice his concerns without sounding like a hypocrite or worse, a bigot. Yet that's exactly what he feared he was becoming. Suddenly, Alex appeared at his side, sensing his father's internal struggle. They stood in silence for a few moments, both staring at the fire, before Alex spoke. "Dad, I know this is probably hard for you," he began cautiously, "but I need you to understand something. Jasmine, she's important to me. She's not just some passing thing. We're serious about each other." Harris clenched his jaw, still watching the fire. "I know you're serious, Alex. I can see that. But have you thought about how complicated this could get? Have you thought about what people will say? How they'll look at you too?" Alex turned to face his father, his expression firm. "Yes, I've thought about it. And I don't care. I care about her. That's what matters. Not what other people think." Harris's eyes flickered with frustration. "You say that now, but the world isn't as simple as you think it is. People have certain expectations, certain standards." Alex shook his head. "You mean your expectations, your standards?" Harris winced at the truth in Alex's words. He couldn't deny it. His son was right. The discomfort he was feeling had nothing to do with Jasmine and everything to do with his own worldview. "I've spent my whole life trying to protect you," Harris said, his voice quieter now. "To give you a good life, to make sure you had every opportunity. I don't want you to throw it all away because of something you might regret later." Alex's face softened. "Dad, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but this isn't something I'll regret. I love her, and I want you to get to know her, not just tolerate her." The words hit Harris harder than he expected. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, to say that he wasn't just tolerating Jasmine, but deep down, he knew that's exactly what he had been doing. Just then, the sound of laughter from the kitchen floated into the room. Jasmine and Evelyn were talking easily, and Harris could hear the warmth in their voices. Evelyn, always so open-hearted, had already accepted Jasmine. And Harris, well, Harris had built a wall between them before he had even met her. Alex sighed, breaking the heavy silence. "Dad, there's something else I need to tell you." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Jasmine's family. They're from here, and I think you might already know them." Harris frowned, his confusion evident. "What do you mean, I know them?" Alex shifted uncomfortably. "Her last name is Thompson. I know you probably don't remember, but Jasmine's family applied to rent one of your properties last month." Harris's heart skipped a beat. The Thompsons. His mind raced back to the application he had discarded without a second thought. He hadn't even given it serious consideration. The name, the family details, it was all coming back to him in a rush. "They're the family you rejected," Alex said, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of the revelation. "The same family you decided wasn't right for your properties." Harris stood there, frozen, his face drained of color. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The young woman sitting in his kitchen, laughing with his wife, was part of the very family he had dismissed as unworthy of living in his exclusive neighborhood. The realization hit him like a freight train, knocking the wind out of him. That's not possible," Harris stammered, his mind scrambling for an explanation. "It is," Alex said firmly. "And that's why I wanted to tell you now, before it all came out later. I didn't want you to hear this from someone else." Jasmine didn't know about it either until a few days ago. Harris felt sick to his stomach. His own son's girlfriend, someone he could already tell was a good, decent person, was from the family he had rejected because of his narrow, prejudiced view of the world. The weight of it was crushing. "I didn't know," Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who they were." Alex's expression softened slightly, but his words were still pointed. "You didn't need to know. That's the problem, Dad. You made that decision without even giving them a chance." Harris stood there, struggling to process everything. His mind raced with 1,000 conflicting emotions: shame, guilt, anger at himself. He had been so sure of his principles, so certain that his way was the right way. But now, faced with the truth of his own actions, he realized just how blind he had been. "I need some air," Harris muttered, pushing past Alex and heading toward the door. He needed to clear his head, to think about what this all meant, not just for his relationship with his son, but for everything he had believed about the world and his place in it. As Harris stepped outside into the cool evening air, the weight of his choices pressed down on him harder than ever before. He had prided himself on building a world of exclusivity, a world where he could control who was allowed in and who wasn't. But now, that very world was collapsing in on itself, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what to do. The apology and the awakening. Mr. Harris stepped into the crisp night air, the cold biting at his skin as he took long, deliberate breaths. His mind was a chaotic whirl of emotions he could no longer suppress. The revelation about Jasmine's family, the Thompsons, had hit him harder than he ever could have anticipated. He had always thought of himself as a fair, successful businessman. He wasn't some overt racist or the type of person to openly insult someone based on their skin color, but he was realizing now how subtle and insidious his prejudices had been. He had rejected the Thompsons without a second thought. Not because they couldn't afford the rent, not because they weren't respectable, but because of his own quiet, unspoken assumptions about what it meant to maintain the atmosphere of his properties. He had convinced himself that he was protecting his tenants, keeping the neighborhood exclusive and safe, when in truth, he was simply perpetuating the same old divisions that had plagued society for generations. And now, that rejection wasn't just an abstract decision on a piece of paper. It had a face, a name. Jasmine Thompson wasn't just a young woman his son was dating. She was the daughter of the family he had so callously dismissed. The weight of that realization pressed down on him like an anchor, and for the first time in years, Harris felt ashamed of the man he had become. He walked slowly down the front path, away from the house, away from the conversation that would undoubtedly resume inside. He needed space. He needed to think. The moonlight cast long shadows across the lawn as he wandered aimlessly, lost in thought. His mind kept circling back to the same question: what kind of man am I? He had always prided himself on being a provider, a self-made man who had built something from nothing. But what was it all worth if, in the process, he had become someone who couldn't see past the color of a person's skin? Someone who rejected families like the Thompsons without even getting to know them. After what felt like hours, Harris stopped at the edge of his property, looking out over the neatly trimmed hedges and the immaculate houses beyond. This neighborhood, this carefully constructed community, what had it really cost him? And more importantly, what had it cost others? He had made it exclusive, yes, but at what price? The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Alex approaching, his son's face a mixture of concern and quiet determination. Harris could tell that Alex wasn't just coming to check on him. He had something he wanted to say. "Dad," Alex said, stopping a few feet away. "I know this is hard for you, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me and Jasmine. This is about you, about how you've been living your life and the choices you've been making." Harris's stomach churned. He knew his son was right, but hearing it out loud was like pouring salt on an open wound. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, a man who followed his own rules. But now those rules felt hollow, shallow even. "I've spent my whole life building something," Harris said, his voice strained. "I thought I was protecting my family, protecting what I worked for. But now, I don't know if I even understand what I've been protecting." Alex took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Dad, I get it. You came from nothing, and you built all of this. You've always wanted the best for us. But sometimes protecting what you've built means tearing down the walls you've put up. You can't keep people out just because they don't fit into your idea of who belongs here." Harris felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his decisions. But now, standing here with his son, he felt like a man who had been living in a house of cards. And now, with one gust of truth, the whole structure was collapsing. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Harris said quietly, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "I know, Dad," Alex said, his tone softer now. "But the right thing isn't always easy, and it's not always comfortable. It means looking at yourself in the mirror and admitting that maybe you've been wrong." Harris swallowed hard. He had always thought of himself as a fair man. But fairness, he was beginning to realize, wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding how those rules affected others. And the truth was, his rules had hurt people like the Thompsons. "I don't know how to fix this," Harris admitted, his voice heavy with remorse. "I don't know where to start." Alex stepped closer, his expression filled with a mixture of compassion and resolve. "You start by admitting you were wrong. You start by apologizing." Harris nodded slowly, the realization settling deep in his bones. He had always taught Alex to take responsibility for his actions, to own up to his mistakes. Now it was his turn to live by that lesson. The walk back to the house felt like a march towards something inevitable. Harris wasn't sure how the conversation with Jasmine would go, but he knew he owed her and her family an apology, a real one that came from a place of understanding, not just guilt. When they stepped inside, Harris found Jasmine and Evelyn still seated at the dining room table, their conversation light and easy, though the tension from earlier still lingered in the air. Jasmine looked up when Harris and Alex entered, her eyes searching his face for some clue as to what was coming next. Harris cleared his throat, feeling suddenly awkward and out of place in his own home. He wasn't used to admitting he was wrong, especially not to a young woman he barely knew. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making things right. "Jasmine," Harris began, his voice quieter than usual. "There's something I need to say." The room fell silent. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly, and Alex took a seat beside Jasmine, offering her a reassuring glance. Harris remained standing, his hands clasped tightly together, as if holding on to his own pride for one final moment before letting it go. "I owe you and your family an apology," Harris said, his words measured but sincere. I didn't give your family a fair chance. When your application came across my desk, I didn't look at the details. I didn't even consider it. I made a decision based on assumptions that I've held on to for far too long." Jasmine's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She had expected resistance from Harris, maybe even a confrontation. But an apology. That was something she hadn't anticipated. I've spent a lot of my life believing that I was doing the right thing by protecting what I've built. Harris continued, his voice steady now. But I've realized that in trying to protect it, I've hurt people. People like your family. And I was wrong for that. Jasmine remained silent for a moment, processing his words. She had experienced her fair share of discrimination, both overt and subtle, throughout her life. And while she had learned to brush off the more obvious instances, the kind that came from people like Harris, people in positions of power, had always stung the most. They were the ones who didn't say the words out loud, but their actions spoke volumes. "Thank you," Jasmine said finally, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology. But it's not just about what you did to my family. It's about how many families have been affected by decisions like the one you made. It's about the system you've helped build." Harris nodded slowly, taking in her words. She was right. This wasn't just about one decision. It was about a lifetime of choices that had contributed to a system of exclusion. A system he had benefited from, but that had harmed others. "I know," Harris said quietly, "and I don't expect an apology to fix everything. But I want to do better. I want to make things right." Jasmine looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening slightly. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but she could see that he was genuinely trying. And that was a start. "I hope you do," she said simply, "because people like my family deserve to be treated with the same respect and consideration as anyone else." Harris nodded again, the weight of her words settling over him. This was only the beginning of his reckoning, a long overdue awakening to the ways in which he had failed, not just as a landlord, but as a man. But for the first time, he was ready to face it. As the evening wound down, the atmosphere in the room began to lighten. Evelyn, ever the peacemaker, made sure the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, and soon enough there was laughter again. But Harris knew that this was only the first step. His apology, while meaningful, was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward change. That night, as Harris lay in bed beside Evelyn, he stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had spent his whole life convinced that he was doing the right thing, but now he realized that doing the right thing meant more than just protecting what he had built. It meant opening himself up to others, challenging his own beliefs, and breaking down the walls he had spent years constructing. And for the first time in a long time, Harris felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that he could change. Hope that with time, he could make amends. Hope that the world could be better if people like him were willing to admit when they were wrong. Redemption and the challenge of change. The days following Mr. Harris's apology were filled with a strange sense of quiet resolve. The apology had been the first critical step, but the road ahead stretched long and uncertain. Harris was not a man who easily gave up control or accepted his own faults. For so long, he had built his identity around his success, his authority, and his perceived fairness. But now, everything he thought he knew about himself was being questioned. Change didn't come naturally to him. And the truth was, Harris wasn't sure how to begin the process of redemption. Words were one thing, but actions, the real, transformative actions that required humility and introspection, were an entirely different challenge. Harris knew that the people he had excluded from his world, people like Jasmine and her family, deserved more than just an apology. They deserved genuine effort, and that effort would mean facing some uncomfortable truths about his role in perpetuating injustice. It started with small changes. The first came on a Monday morning, when Harris sat down in his office and stared at the stack of rental applications on his desk. For years, he had gone through these files with the same discerning eye, focusing on details that, in retrospect, seemed trivial: income levels, educational background, credit scores. But now, as he looked through the applications, he realized that his judgment had often been clouded by something far more insidious: a quiet, unacknowledged bias that had led him to reject families like the Thompsons, families who were more than qualified but didn't fit his narrow vision of who should live in his properties. Harris picked up an application from a family with a name he would have once dismissed out of hand. The applicant, Marcus Jackson, had applied for one of Harris's more modest properties in a middle-income neighborhood. Harris scanned the application. Marcus worked as a firefighter. His wife, Denise, was a nurse, and they had 2 young children. Their finances were stable, their credit was good, but Harris knew that just a few weeks ago he would have hesitated. He would have made some excuse to himself, rationalized a decision to reject them, all while telling himself that it wasn't about race. But now he saw his own thought process for what it was, a defense mechanism that kept him comfortable in his exclusionary world. He took a deep breath and signed the approval, placing the application in the acceptance pile. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental to him. For the first time, he was making a conscious effort to let go of the biases that had shaped his decisions for years. Meanwhile, the relationship between Alex and Jasmine continued to deepen. The initial tension that had surrounded their introduction to Harris had begun to soften, and though there were still moments of awkwardness, Jasmine could see that Harris was trying. She had been hesitant at first, wary of his sudden change of heart, but over time, she began to sense a real desire on his part to make amends. Still, Jasmine knew that redemption wasn't a simple, linear process. It wasn't something that could be achieved with a single act of kindness or a well-timed apology. Real change required sustained effort, and Harris had a long way to go. Jasmine had grown up understanding the complexities of race in America. She had seen firsthand how even the most well-meaning people could harbor deep-seated prejudices that shaped their decisions and interactions. And while she was willing to give Harris the benefit of the doubt, she wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Alex sat together in her apartment, Jasmine brought up the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I'm glad your dad apologized," Jasmine said carefully, her eyes meeting Alex. "But I can't help wondering if he really understands what it means. Apologies are great, but what happens when things get hard again? What happens when he's faced with another decision that challenges his comfort zone?" Alex nodded slowly, understanding her hesitation. He had grown up seeing his father as a man of principle, someone who believed in hard work and fairness. But the events of the past few weeks had revealed another side of him, a side that had been shaped by privilege and an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. "I get it," Alex said softly. "I've been asking myself the same thing. My dad's trying, but it's going to take more than a few good deeds to really change things." Jasmine sighed, leaning back against the couch. "It's just, I've seen this before, you know. People say they want to change, they say they understand, but when it comes down to it, they revert back to what's comfortable. I don't want that to happen here. Not with us." Alex reached out, taking her hand in his. "It won't. I promise. I'm going to hold him accountable. And I'm going to hold myself accountable too. This isn't just about him. It's about all of us." Jasmine smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. "I hope so." As weeks passed, Harris found himself grappling with a newfound sense of accountability. His small acts of change, like approving the Jackson family's application, felt good at first. They gave him a sense of progress, of moving in the right direction. But soon, he realized that these individual decisions, while important, were just scratching the surface. The deeper work, the work that involved changing not just his actions, but his mindset, was far more difficult. One day, Harris was sitting in his office when he received a call from an old colleague, George Whitman, a man he had done business with for years. George was the kind of person Harris had always admired. Successful, no nonsense, and unafraid to make tough decisions. They had shared similar values when it came to real estate, keeping things exclusive, maintaining the right kind of neighborhood. It was an unspoken agreement between them. "Harris, how are you?" George's voice boomed through the speakerphone. "It's been too long. I hear you've been making some changes over there." Harris tensed, unsure of where the conversation was going. "Yeah, I've been rethinking a few things." George chuckled. "Rethinking, huh? Look, I've been hearing some chatter about you approving rentals to families that don't quite fit the mold. You know, I've always respected the way you've handled your properties. You've kept the standards high. But lately, it seems like you're letting things slide." Harris felt his chest tighten. He knew what George was getting at. It was the same old coded language. Standards, the right kind of people, exclusive. These were the words that had once made sense to him, words that had formed the foundation of his business. But now, hearing them from George, they felt hollow, even repulsive. "I'm not letting anything slide," Harris said, his voice firm. "I'm making decisions based on what's right, not what's comfortable." There was a pause on the other end of the line before George spoke again, his tone noticeably cooler. "Well, I suppose that's your choice. But you and I both know how quickly neighborhoods can change. You let in the wrong element, and before you know it, property values drop, tenants start complaining, and everything you've built starts to crumble." Harris clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger rise in his chest. For years, he had believed that line of thinking, that opening his properties to families who didn't fit his narrow vision would lead to chaos, to the downfall of everything he had worked for. But now he saw it for what it was. Fear. Fear of change. Fear of losing control. Fear of confronting the uncomfortable truth that his success had come at the expense of others. "I don't think you understand, George," Harris said, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm not afraid of change anymore. I'm not afraid of letting people in. What I'm afraid of is staying the same and pretending it's progress." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Harris could almost hear George's mind racing, trying to process this unexpected shift in their dynamic. "Well," George said finally, his tone icy, "I suppose we'll see how that works out for you, but don't say I didn't warn you." The call ended abruptly, leaving Harris sitting alone in his office, staring at the phone. He had just severed one of his oldest business relationships, but instead of feeling regret, he felt something else. Relief. It was the first time in years that he had stood up to someone who shared the same values he had once held so tightly, and it felt like a victory, not just for him, but for the man he was trying to become. As the weeks turned into months, Harris's efforts to change began to ripple outward. He started attending community meetings, listening to the voices of people he had once ignored or dismissed. He made a point to reach out to families like the Thompsons, not just as a landlord, but as a neighbor, someone who wanted to understand their experiences and their struggles. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when old habits tried to resurface, when the fear of losing control crept back in. But each time, Harris reminded himself of what was at stake, not just his business, but his relationship with his son, his legacy, and his own sense of self. One evening, after another long day of work, Harris found himself sitting at the dinner table with Evelyn, Alex, and Jasmine. The atmosphere was lighter now, more comfortable, though the journey to this point had been anything but smooth. As they ate, Harris glanced over at Jasmine, who was telling a story about a project she was working on for school. He watched her with a sense of quiet admiration. She was everything he had once feared, smart, capable, and completely unafraid to challenge him. But instead of feeling threatened, he felt grateful. Grateful that she had been patient enough to let him learn. Grateful that she hadn't given up on him, even when he had deserved it. "You know," Harris said suddenly, interrupting the conversation, "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to change. I used to think it was about big, dramatic gestures. But I'm starting to realize it's the small, everyday choices that matter the most." Jasmine smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "I think that's true." Alex grinned, giving his father a nod of approval. "It's about time you figured that out, Dad." Harris chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he still had a long way to go. But for the first time, He felt like he was on the right path, the path of redemption, not just for himself, but for the community he had spent so long keeping at arm's length. And in that moment, surrounded by his family, Harris realized that change wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. A legacy rewritten. Months turned into a year, and the quiet transformation in Mr. William Harris' life began to ripple through not just his personal relationships, but also the very fabric of the community he had once held in a tight, exclusive grip. His journey had started with reluctance, sparked by his son's relationship with Jasmine and the unsettling revelation of his own biases. But now it had grown into something much deeper, something much more meaningful. Harris was no longer just trying to make up for past wrongs. He was genuinely reshaping the way he lived, thought, and interacted with the world. It was a Saturday morning, and the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood that Harris had once prided himself on controlling. Today was different, though. There was a new energy in the air, an energy of inclusion, community, and hope. Harris stood in his front yard, watching as families gathered for the neighborhood's first community fair, an event he had never envisioned for this area, but had come to wholeheartedly support. The idea had come from Jasmine, who, after months of hesitant interactions with Harris, had begun to see real change in him. She had suggested that they host a community event, something that would bring people together, break down the invisible walls that had long divided them, and create a space for real connection. Harris had initially balked at the idea, old habits dying hard, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how powerful such a gesture could be. And so, the fair was born. As Harris looked around, he saw families of all backgrounds and races mingling together, their children playing in the park, laughing, and chasing one another across the open field. There was music in the air, food stalls lining the streets, and a sense of camaraderie that felt almost foreign to Harris, yet so right. It wasn't just the familiar faces of longtime residents that dotted the scene. There were new families like the Thompsons and the Jacksons, who had moved into the neighborhood over the past several months, bringing with them a vibrancy that had once been sorely lacking. Harris spotted Robert and Lissa Thompson across the way, talking with a few other neighbors while their boys ran in circles around a bounce house. Robert caught Harris's eye and gave him a small nod, a gesture that was neither overly friendly nor hostile, but one that acknowledged the difficult road they had traveled to get here. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start, and Harris knew that he would have to earn their full trust over time, not with words, but with consistent actions. Jasmine and Alex were busy at one of the booths, serving food and drinks to the guests. Harris's heart swelled with pride as he watched them work together, their easy laughter and warm energy contagious to everyone around them. Alex had grown even closer to his father over the past year, and while their relationship had never been severely strained, there was a newfound respect between them, one built on honesty and openness rather than the silent assumptions that had once dictated their interactions. Jasmine, too, had come to view Harris differently. She no longer saw him as the rigid, unyielding man who had once rejected her family out of hand. Instead, she saw him as someone capable of change, someone willing to confront his own flaws and do the hard work of self-reflection. Their relationship was still a work in progress, but there was mutual respect there now, and that was more than she had ever expected when they first met. As Harris stood watching the scene unfold, Evelyn joined him, slipping her hand into his. She smiled up at him, her eyes filled with pride. Evelyn had always been the heart of their family, the one who had shown grace and compassion, even when Harris had been blinded by his own pride. She had welcomed Jasmine into their home from the start, and her steady influence had helped guide Harris through the difficult moments of his transformation. "You've come a long way," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with warmth. Harris nodded, still watching the crowd. "We all have," he replied, "but there's still a lot more to do." Evelyn smiled knowingly. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But look at this. You've helped create something real, something that will last." Harris didn't respond right away. But he knew she was right. The old Harris, the man who had once viewed his properties and his community as a fortress to be protected at all costs, was gone. In his place was someone else. Someone who had learned that strength didn't come from exclusion, but from inclusion. He had learned that a legacy wasn't just about what you built with your hands, but what you built with your heart. A few hours later, Harris found himself standing at one of the booths, sipping lemonade, and making small talk with a few of the new residents. The conversations were easy, natural in a way that would have been impossible just a year ago. He spoke with Marcus Jackson, the firefighter whose family had been one of the first Harris had approved after his change of heart. Marcus's warmth and humor made the conversation flow easily, and Harris felt a sense of connection with the man that transcended the usual tenant-landlord dynamic. As they spoke, a figure appeared from the crowd that caused Harris's heart to skip a beat. Robert Thompson, the patriarch of the Thompson family, the man Harris had wronged so deeply, approached with a purposeful stride. Harris tensed, unsure of what to expect. Over the past year, Robert had been cordial but distant, a man who had every right to withhold forgiveness until he saw proof of real change. "William," Robert said, his voice even but guarded, "do you have a minute?" Harris set his lemonade down, nodding. "Of course, Robert." The two men stepped aside from the busy booth, finding a quieter spot near a row of tall trees that lined the edge of the park. The shade provided a welcome break from the sun, but the tension in the air was undeniable. "I wanted to talk to you," Robert began, crossing his arms over his chest. "About everything." Harris braced himself, fully prepared for whatever Robert was about to say. He had spent the past year trying to make amends, but he knew that forgiveness was not something he was entitled to. He had wronged this man and his family, and no amount of community fairs or friendly conversations could erase that fact. "I've watched you over the past year," Robert continued, his gaze steady. "I've seen the changes you've made. Approving our application, apologizing to Jasmine, it was a good start. But I've been waiting to see if it was just a one-time thing, or if you really meant it." Harris swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I meant it," he said quietly. "I still mean it. I know I can't undo what I did to your family, but I've been trying to be better, to do better." Robert studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "I've seen that, and I respect that you're making the effort. But you need to understand something, William. It's not just about us. It's about the system you've been a part of for so long, the system that kept families like mine out, that made it harder for us to find a place to live, to feel safe in our own neighborhood." Harris's chest tightened with shame. He knew that Robert was right. His actions hadn't just hurt the Thompsons, they had contributed to a larger system of exclusion and inequality that had far-reaching consequences. It wasn't enough to change his own behavior. He had to help dismantle the very system he had once upheld. "I know it," Harris said, his voice filled with regret. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I don't want to just make small changes. I want to be part of something bigger, something that creates real opportunities for everyone." Robert's expression softened slightly, but there was still a wariness in his eyes. "It's going to take more than just good intentions, William. You have to be willing to challenge the people around you, the ones who still think like you used to. You've got to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." Harris nodded, understanding the weight of what Robert was saying. It wasn't enough to change himself. He had to challenge the very foundations of the world he had once operated in. It would mean difficult conversations with old friends, facing backlash from people like George Whitman, and potentially losing business relationships he had once relied on. But if there was one thing Harris had learned over the past year, it was that real change was never easy. "I'm willing to do that," Harris said, his voice steady. "I've already started." Robert studied him for a moment longer, then extended his hand. "Then we can move forward. But this isn't the end, William. It's just the beginning." Harris took Robert's hand, feeling the weight of the unspoken agreement between them. This wasn't about absolution. It was about responsibility. Responsibility for the past, for the present, and for the future. As they stood there, shaking hands beneath the shade of the trees, Harris felt a sense of clarity settle over him. This moment, this handshake, wasn't just about the two of them. It was about the legacy he would leave behind. The real legacy. Not the one built on exclusion and control, but the one built on inclusion, fairness, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. For the first time in his life, Harris felt like he was standing on solid ground, not because of what he had built, but because of what he was willing to rebuild. In the months that followed, Harris became a vocal advocate for fair housing practices. He started attending city council meetings, advocating for policies that would create more affordable housing and ensure that families of all backgrounds had access to safe, welcoming communities. He began mentoring other landlords, encouraging them to examine their own biases and make changes that would benefit everyone, not just a select few. His properties, once the epitome of exclusivity, became known as places where diversity was celebrated and where families of all races, backgrounds, and economic statuses could find a home. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and resistance from those who still clung to the old ways of thinking. But Harris remained steadfast, knowing that the work he was doing was more important than his own comfort. As for his relationship with Alex and Jasmine, it continued to grow stronger. They got engaged a year after that first difficult meeting, and Harris, once so resistant to change, found himself genuinely excited about their future together. He had come to see Jasmine not as someone who challenged his worldview, but as someone who had helped him see the world more clearly. She had been the catalyst for his transformation, and for that, he was forever grateful. On the day of their wedding, as Harris watched his son marry the woman he loved, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. His legacy, once so tightly controlled and narrowly defined, had expanded in ways he never could have imagined. And in that expansion, he had found not just redemption, but purpose. As the newlyweds danced together under the soft glow of the evening lights, Harris stood with Evelyn, his heart full. This, he realized, was the legacy he wanted to leave behind, not one of wealth or success, but one of love, acceptance, and the courage to change. A legacy rewritten.